So the next few slides are supposed to be included on the previous recording, so we'll just end up talking about them here. So in terms of the digestive processes of the mouth, obviously the mouth is involved in ingestion, mechanical digestion in the process of chewing, propulsion, which is the process of deglutition, which is swallowing. There's a little bit of chemical digestion in the mouth as well with our salivary amylases and our lingual lipases. However, there is no absorption in the mouth. And there's a few exceptions to this in that some drugs can be absorbed through the oral cavity. There's nitroglycerin, which can be for the heart. So someone who feels like they might be having a heart attack could put that sublingually under their tongue, and that'll dissolve and be absorbed through the oral cavity. But in terms of nutrient absorption, we don't have any absorption occurring within the mouth. Now, in terms of mastication and deglutition, which is chewing and swallowing, mastication is just a fancy word for chewing. Obviously, it's going to involve the tongue and the teeth and the cheeks. And the whole purpose of mastication, again, is to form that kind of compacted food ball called our bolus. Okay. Now, in terms of mastication, it's partly voluntary, partly reflexive, in that as our cheeks feel the pressure from the food pushing on it, and the tongues and the gums, you're going to have this reflexive response to chewing. Now, once that food particle or that bolus becomes compacted enough, what will happen is the tongue will initiate the process of deglutition, which is the process of swallowing. So deglutition involves the tongue, the soft palate, which is located way back, just above or just prior to your uvula, the pharynx, and the esophagus. And when we look at deglutition, there's actually two phases that exist. There's a buccal phase, which is our voluntary contraction of the tongue. This is the voluntary, the one we have control over. And then there's the pharyngeal esophageal phase, which this is the involuntary phase in which the vagus nerve drives the contraction of the muscles within the esophagus and the pharynx to move that bolus down through the esophagus via a peristalsis reaction. So what happens is the following. During chewing, okay, you're sitting there chewing. This is the buccal phase, okay. Eventually, you're going to form that bolus, and you're going to push essentially your tongue towards the superior, or towards the roof of your mouth against the hard palate, and it will start to move that bolus towards the posterior, towards the oral pharynx of the oral cavity, okay? When that bolus moves into the oral pharynx, we basically move into the pharyngeal esophageal phase. Now, one thing about this phase, this buccal phase, is that the sphincter that separates or that is within the upper esophagus is actually closed. So this bolus enters the esophageal or the oropharynx region, okay? And then as the tongue blocks, okay, this regurgitation, okay, the involuntary reflexive response takes over. And what happens is the larynx will rise essentially so that the epiglottis, which we talked about last week, okay, blocks the flow into the trachea. Okay, so as the larynx rises, the epiglottis blocks off the trachea, so nothing can go down there. This bolus is diverted down into the esophagus, where the sphincter relaxes and food is then able to enter into the esophagus. Now, through a peristalsis contraction, this bolus is then moved down the esophagus, okay, and it approaches this upper gastroesophageal sphincter As this bolus moves down, okay, the sphincter opens, and then the bolus enters the stomach. Now again, essentially from here to here is all involuntary. The only voluntary phase is that buccal phase. Okay, so now we have our bolus in the stomach. Okay, and the stomach is a temporary site of storage. It's where mechanical digestion can occur, but as well as chemical digestion. So the organization of the muscularis layer in the stomach provides it or allows it to have some mechanical breakdown, but we often associated the stomach with its ability to carry out chemical digestion. Now, that bolus in the stomach that's just entered into the stomach gets converted into another substance known as chyme. So the bolus enters the stomach, but what leaves the stomach is not a bolus, it is chyme. Okay? So when we look at the stomach, its nerve supply is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And that means that it's controlled or has innervation from both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Majority of what we'll see is that the parasympathetic involvement comes from the vagus nerve, okay? And that's because that's the only cranial nerve that goes below kind of the cervical region within the body. So the parasympathetic, again, that's a kind of our rest and digest. The sympathetic comes from the thoracic splenic nerve via the celiac plexus. We learned a little bit about this in AMP1, but not extensively. Our blood supply comes from the celiac, excuse me, the celiac trunk, which is this arrow structure here. And then it branches off into the gastric and the splenic branches. The vein or the draining of that blood empties into the hepatic portal system. When we look at the anatomy of the stomach, it's actually a quite complex structure, even though it has a temporary storage site. It has this kind of kidney bean shape to it. The top region here is called the fundus. Now, the women in the class may say, well, the uterus also has a fundus, and that is true. A fundus is just a general term used for a kind of an upward curvature. The uterus also has that upward curvature as well. Then we have two curvatures to our stomach. We have the greater curvature, which is this outer curvature, and the lesser curvature, which is this inner curvature. Okay. We have 3 layers of muscle within our stomach. Now, when we talked about the tunics in the last video, I talked about just 2 of them. This oblique layer is unique to the stomach, and we'll talk about that here on the slides coming up. I think I talk about it, yes. So we'll come back to this notion, but this is a unique layer to the stomach. In addition to that, obviously we have a large opening, the lumen of our stomach, and the walls of the stomach are actually comprised of structures known as rugae. And the rugae are essentially, imagine like, remember, your stomach has to be able to expand and shrink, right? So what happens is when the stomach is full, your stomach has more of a flat appearance to it. When it's empty, right, as it shrinks down, the mucosa, right? So if you kind of have this as an enlarged, right, when this shrinks down, this same wall, right, is going to have kind of like this type of appearance to it, okay? So that it makes up less space, right? And that's what this rugae is here. These kind of squiggles that you're seeing here. Now we have kind of different regions that are referred to as we enter or approach the small intestines. The duodenum here is the first segment of the small intestines. And what separates the small intestine from the stomach is a sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. And so the region right before the pyloric sphincter is called the pyloric canal. And that is because as the chyme is rotated or basically starting to be digested within the stomach, it's going to be funneled down into the canal region, then empty into the duodenum. So those are the basic kind of features of our stomach, or the anatomical features of our stomach. So the stomach has all 4 tunics. The mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, as well as the serosa, or that fourth visceral peritoneum layer. However, it does have some modifications to both the mucosa and the muscularis externa layer. Okay, so in terms of the muscularis externa layer, which again is that muscular layer, right? It has 3 layers of smooth muscle, not just the 2, and I mentioned that on the previous slide. So that inner oblique layer, okay, allows the stomach. So normally the other 2 layers really allow for mixed or forward and back movement. Okay, so peristalsis and segmentation are really good for those 2 layers. However, the addition of this oblique layer allows you to kind of have a turning motion that occurs. So this oblique layer increases your ability to basically carry out that mechanical digestion that we talked about in the last video. So you get this turning, mixing, and moving and physical breakdown of food by the addition of that 3rd muscular layer, that oblique layer. In addition to the muscularis externa layer being modified, the mucosa layer is also modified. So it's made up of a simple columnar epithelium. Okay. However, this simple columnar epithelium has a ton of mucus cells that secrete a substance that serves as a protective coating to the stomach, because we're going to learn here in a few minutes that the stomach, obviously, or some of you already may know this, right, is a very acidic environment. So we have to have a mucus membrane that protects this tissue, otherwise it would be basically destroyed by the acidic environment. In addition to this, we have gastric pits and glands that exist within the mucosal layer of our epithelium. The pits are these immediate structures that kind of dive down and lead to these much more complex structures, which are the glands that exist down deep within that mucosal layer. The gastric glands themselves, this region down here, is the region that is going to produce the gastric juices that are going to help with the chemical digestion of the foodstuff within our stomach. So in looking at these gastric glands, the gland itself is comprised of 4 different cell populations. Up towards the top, we have a population of cells known as the mucous neck cells. These secrete a thin acidic mucus. The function of that mucus isn't really known, and it's different than the surface epithelium, which is going to be secreting an alkaline mucus that protects the underlying tissue from that acidic environment. Okay. The bulk of the gastric glands in terms of the functional anatomy of the stomach comes from these 3 cell populations: our parietal cells, our chief cells, and our enteroendocrine cells. So let's look at these 3 cell populations. So our chief cell is one cell population that exists in the gastric glands. And these chief cells are responsible for secreting a protein known as pepsinogen. And pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme. Okay. Upon its activation, pepsinogen becomes pepsin. Okay. And pepsin is going to basically break down our protein. So how you can think about this is pepsinogen, right, HCl, and we'll talk about where HCl comes from in a minute, creates pepsin, and pepsin will target proteins. Okay. In addition to chief cells secreting pepsinogen, they also secrete lipases. Remember, our lipases are our lipid enzymes. Okay, so about 15% of our lipids will start the process of digestion within the stomach. Okay, now this up here talks about the fact that once HCl activates pepsin, pepsin can actually come back and actually act on pepsinogen. So you get this self-positive feedback mechanism that occurs within this cycle. Now, In order for us to convert pepsinogen into pepsin, we need HCl. And HCl stands for hydrochloric acid. This is a very strong acid. Okay. So HCl has like a pH of like 1. Okay. So what happens is the following. This HCl, okay, again, is required to cleave or activate pepsinogen into pepsin. But what this also does is denatures our proteins. Okay. And when we talk about denaturing proteins, what we're doing is we're not, remember, proteins take on a very complex shape to them. So they have that primary and that secondary, that tertiary and that quaternary structure that we talked about in chapter 2 of AMP1. And so what this hydrochloric acid does is it doesn't break down the protein into individual amino acids. It takes that really complex quaternary structure and breaks it down into a single chain so that when it moves on into the small intestines and gets exposed to proteases, which are going to break down proteins, they're more easily, that molecule is more easily accessible. Okay. In addition to our parietal cells secreting HCl, they also secrete a factor known as intrinsic factor. Now, intrinsic factor becomes super important because intrinsic factor is a glycoprotein, and it's required for vitamin B12 within the small intestines. So a lack of vitamin B12 in your body and your bloodstream, okay, can be due to two things. One, you're not making enough B12. Two, you're not having enough B12 in your diet. Or three, your intrinsic factor isn't being produced at enough. So if your if your decrease in vitamin B12 is due to intrinsic factor, taking oral B12 will not help you because it has no way of being absorbed in the body unless intrinsic factor is there. Okay? So you need that intrinsic factor in order to absorb B12 out of your diet. The last population of cells that we'll find in these gastric glands are our enteroendocrine cells. And enteroendocrine cells are going to secrete chemical messengers into the lamina propria. So what's unique is we just talked about the chief cells and the parietal cells, and they secrete into the lumen, and this lumen will go up onto the surface of the stomach. Enteroendocrine cells secrete out into the lamina propria, where typically there's a blood supply. And these chemical messengers will enter the blood supply and then be able to transmit signals to other parts of the digestive system. So enteroendocrine cells secrete substances such as serotonin and histamines. They also secrete two other hormones known as somatostatin and as well as gastrin. Okay, and we'll talk about these a little bit more here in just a few minutes. Now, a little bit about this mucosal barrier. Our stomach is obviously subjected to a very, very harsh pH. And so it needs to have a protective barrier so that it can protect not only the epithelium, but the underlying submucosa and muscularis externa layer. So what this means is that the mucus barrier that exists on the surface of the stomach is comprised of a super rich, there's our fun molecule again, bicarbonate ion. Okay? Because remember, bicarbonate can bind hydrogens, and then this becomes, which is actually a weak acid, okay, which we'll learn about much later in the semester. But this is really good for kind of neutralizing those free hydrogen ions. In addition, as a protective mechanism to prevent that acidic environment of the stomach and the secretions of those acidic secretions from getting down to underlying tissues, the epithelium within the stomach are held together by tight junctions, right? Remember those tight junctions? These are our waterproof junctions that exist between cells. So you form, right, your zipper, okay, in between those cells so that the liquid of the stomach can't seep down through that. Any damaged epithelium is replaced fairly quickly by a stem cell population that exists within the epithelium. Your surface epithelium is replaced about every 3 to 6 days, just because there's going to be some damage to that epithelium. So there's a constant turnover of the cells of the stomach. Some homeostatic imbalances. One is gastritis. Again, anytime you see itis, this suffix here means inflammation. Gastro is stomach. So anytime you have anything that causes an inflammatory response within the stomach, this will result in an inflammatory response. Now, again, it's not necessarily within the stomach. It's if you have any type of substance that breaches that mucosal barrier will result in inflammation. Now, in severe cases, you can actually get erosion of the stomach wall. This will lead to peptic or gastric ulcers. This is what a gastric ulcer looks like. Okay, this is a big hole. This can be very dangerous because you imagine the stomach contents, which are very acidic, getting outside of the stomach into the abdominal cavity. Now where it can wreak havoc on other organs of the digestive system. So this can result in what's known as peritonitis, which is inflammation of the peritoneal cavity. Okay, this can also lead to hemorrhage because you basically have that acidic environment now targeting blood vessels within the abdominal cavity or the peritoneal cavity, and those then can cause perforations of the blood vessels, and you can actually hemorrhage as a result of that. Traditionally, or old school folk, or old like wives' tales, used to be that stress caused ulcers, and now it's known that it's actually a bacteria that causes most ulcers. People that have most ulcers, and this is called Helicobacter pylori or H. pylori. That causes these stomach ulcers. Now, with that said, I think there is some evidence that shows that people who are overly stress can lead to more abundance of H. pylori. So this notion that stress causes ulcers has a little bit of footing to it, but it's actually the H. pylori itself that causes the majority of the ulcers. Other ulcers can be caused by NSAIDs. NSAIDs are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. These are things such as ibuprofen, Advil, Motrin. Those are all your NSAIDs, okay, that are over the counter. Obviously, there's a lot of non-over-the-counter NSAIDs as well. So, we just talked about the cell population that is involved in this secretion process, but what drives the secretion of these juices, or of these gastric juices, okay? So when we look at the regulation of gastric secretion, it occurs both through a neural as well as a hormonal mechanism, okay? So the stomach secretes about 3 liters of gastric juice per day. Activation of the vagus nerve will increase secretion, right? So if you think about that, right, this is parasympathetic, right? And we know that parasympathetic is often defined as our rest and digest, which tells us that if we activate the vagus, which means we activate the parasympathetic, means we're going to digest, which means we're going to increase secretions, okay? If we activate sympathetic, right, this is our fight and flight, right? We're running away from a bear. We don't want to worry about digestion, right? So the system will shut down secretion when we activate the sympathetic, okay? Now, hormonally, the majority of our secretion is driven by the hormone gastrin. So you secrete gastrin, you increase enzyme, you increase HCl secretion, okay? Now, once we move into the small intestine, the majority of the secretions of the small intestine actually are going to target gastrin and turn it off. They're called gastrin antagonists, and we'll talk about that here in a little while. Okay, so we have 3 phases to gastric secretion. Our first phase is our cephalic phase, okay? Okay, an eye, and a nose. Okay? So your cephalic phase is that it's a conditional reflex that triggers the secretion of our gastric juices just by our senses. So you see the food, you walk into the house, you smell that turkey cooking, right? You taste, right? Before that bolus even gets to the stomach, the taste buds initiate secretion of our gastric juices, and touch will also trigger that response. Okay, so our first phase. So again, what we're looking at here is how pepsinogen and HCl and those enteroendocrine cell hormones are all secreted and what they're driven by. Okay, so the first thing is the cephalic phase. The second phase, okay, or the second way in which we trigger that gastric regulation is through the gastric phase. Okay, now that bolus you've just swallowed, okay, and that bolus enters the stomach. Okay, now because that food has entered the stomach, you're going to get distension. That's just a fancy word for stretching. Okay, you're going to start to create peptides. Okay, remember that pepsinogen converts into pepsin. Pepsin will start breaking down some of those proteins a little bit. Okay, you'll have a low acidity. And the biggest thing here is you start to secrete gastrin. By those enteroendocrine cells start to dump a massive amount of gastrin. Now, gastrin results in the release of pepsinogen and HCl. Okay, so really gastrin is the driving force for how pepsinogen and how HCl are secreted. Okay, so there's 3 chemicals involved in this process: acetylcholine, histamine, and gastrin. All stimulate those parietal cells for maximum HCl release. Now, this acetylcholine here is actually coming from the cephalic phase. So when I see that pie sitting there, right, my mouth starts watering, that nerve, okay, will trigger will go down, trigger the vagus nerve will go down, okay, target the stomach and initiate, okay, the secretion of HCl from our parietal cells. Okay. Now, our third phase is called the intestinal phase. Okay. So what happens in the intestinal phase, we get a stimulatory component. So first, we get this initial boost or burst in gastrin release. Okay. It's kind of like the intestinal phase is kind of like this, oh my gosh, hurry up, because we're about to move this bolus or this chyme onto the next compartment, which is the small intestine. So do your thing as best you can, right? So this big dump of gastrin happens. Okay. Meanwhile, that chyme starts to trickle into the duodenum. Okay. So it's starting to build up. Okay. Trickling into the duodenum. Okay. And what happens is you get this, what's known as the enterogastric reflex. And this entry of the chyme that has the hydrogens and the fats and the peptides, it's irritating because it's so acidic, okay, triggers the release of hormones from the small intestines. And these hormones are secretin, cholecystokinin, which is CCK, and vasoactive intestinal peptide, or VIP. These all get secreted and go and inhibit gastrin. Okay. So we have these 3 phases. And again, this inhibitory phase, we're kind of moving out of the regulation of gastric secretion and moving into what the intestines will then start to do. Okay, because we don't want to empty the chyme into the small intestines and still have this massive amount of gastrin and HCl and pepsinogen being secreted. So essentially what happens is as that chyme starts to move into the small intestines, the brake starts to be applied on the gastric process. So as this chyme enters the duodenum, receptors within, the duodenum start to stretch, start to sense these chemicals. They initiate that reflex that we just saw, this reflex here. Okay. And inhibits gastric secretion and completes duodenal filling. Okay. Now, in terms of the makeup of our chyme, carbohydrate-rich chyme moves more quickly through the duodenum. Fat chyme will remain in the duodenum for much longer. So in the next video, we're going to talk about the small intestines and the role of the small intestines now that chyme has gotten there. I highly advise for this process of gastric secretion, I have done a drawing for this portion of the lecture. I highly advise watching that recording because it gives you a better visual of this process.